before I introduce our next guest, I'll read the first paragraph of something he wrote recently. It goes like this. The FBI, I won't read the whole thing, but the FBI has a lead. A prominent religious leader and community advocate is in contact with a suspected sleeper cell of foreign radicals. The Attorney General is briefed and personally approves wiretaps of his home and offices. The man was born in the United States, the son of a popular cleric. Even though he's an American citizen, he's placed on a watch list to be summarily detained in the event of a national emergency. The individual in question is named Martin Luther King Jr. This was released in honor of Martin Luther King's birthday. Alvaro Bedoya has written this piece about the abuse of power in the King surveillance case and what it tells us about. Well, I'll let him speak for himself on that, but Alvaro Bedoya is adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University and founding executive director of the Center on Privacy and Technology there. Prior to coming to Georgetown, he was chief counsel for the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law, and also served as chairman. Senator Al Frank and Alvaro Bedoya, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Richard.
So listen, your point in writing this article about, which was entitled by Slate or by you, The Color of Surveillance, is what precisely?
The point, Richard, is that throughout our history, people of color have been the disproportionate victims of unjust surveillance. That is what I called the color of surveillance. And the problem is that even though what happened to Martin Luther King, people might be aware of it, people aren't aware that it's this broad pattern that goes back hundreds of years and continues to this day. And unfortunately, our privacy and surveillance debate doesn't reflect that. It doesn't reflect the color of surveillance.
You know, I have to say that I found this article absolutely fascinating. And I felt as if somehow on some intuitive level, I might have sensed this or known this, but it hadn't been articulated. And I certainly didn't know the history or the backstory. But I think it's very important for people to understand when we talk, for example, about the surveillance of Muslims today, that people think, well, that's just because of today and what's happened in recent events and all that. But what you're saying is, no, it reflects an underlying pattern.
That's exactly right. I think people tend to look at what happened in the past to Martin Luther King. So the FBI surveilled Martin Luther King. It bugged his hotel rooms. It wiretapped his phones. They look at that as some kind of old and isolated anachronism that primarily had to do with racism. But in reality, it, at least in the words of the FBI and the NSA, by the way, which also wiretapped Martin Luther King, it was about national security. And so I think people nowadays think, oh, you know, the surveillance of Muslims, that's about national security. That's not about any kind of bias or anything like that. When in reality, it's part of a much broader pattern of people like Martin Luther King, like Cesar Chavez, like even W.E.B. Du Bois being surveilled in the name of national security. So I think we need to move away from this idea that just because everyone's watched nowadays, just because we live in this world of NSA national security surveillance, that there isn't bias there, because there's quite a lot of bias.
Certainly. I mean, if you monitor, for example, the header information on everybody's email, let's say, you still have to decide whose email you go in and drill down on. So so let me ask you then, because there's so many resonances or so many dimensions to this issue. In Martin Luther King's case, the suspicion was that he was in contact with communist agents of some kind. In the case of, let's say, an everyday mainstream cleric, Islamic cleric, it might be that he or she is likely to be in contact with foreign agents of some kind. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, although it's a slight digression, but when you start mapping people, social networks and that sort of thing, we're all, as we know from the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon game, we're all a few steps away from somebody suspicious, aren't we? Is that a factor in all this? I don't know if I'm articulating my question
I think you are. And in many ways, it would be slightly less problematic, but still problematic, if there were even a hint of suspicion in many of these cases.
Mm-hmm.
Because you mentioned Muslim clerics being monitored today. That's exactly what happened in New York City. So for a lot of years after 9/11, the NYPD actually teamed up with the CIA. And by the way, when I talk like this, NYPD working with CIA, it kind of sounds like I'm a conspiracy theorist or I'm crazy. I'm not. This is the Associated Press reporting all of this. NYPD teamed up with CIA to basically construct social maps of the Muslim community in New York. And they did this without any suspicion of wrongdoing or any indication that the mosques they were planting so-called mosque crawlers in, and where they were literally recording the license plates of the people parked in those mosques parking lots. Those are instances where the only thing these people were guilty of was being Muslim, which is not a bad thing at all. And so what we're seeing is surveillance in bulk without suspicion and without a warrant. And another example of this, which I can give you, a lot of folks don't realize that the NSA call records program was beta tested on American immigrants. So there again, warrantless, suspicionless surveillance in bulk, targeting minority communities.
Well, Alvaro Bedoya, let me ask you a question, Executive Director of the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown. A lot of people will say, and I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, that, well, if people have done nothing wrong, what's the problem? So they write down their license plates at a mosque. If that's what it takes to keep us safe, what's the problem? You can write down my license plate if you want to.
Sure.
What are you guys complaining about?
Sure. Well, I think folks who say that should think to themselves, so for example, me, I'm not black, right? But I care about racism against African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And, even if I don't, in theory, have something to hide, in the past, our society has treated people like Martin Luther King, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, people like Muhammad Ali, people like Whitney Young, the head of the National Urban League, as criminals. And it has made what they do illegal. And so many of us don't have something to hide, but a lot of people we care about and who have been tremendously important to the development of our society have, in society's eyes, had something to hide. And so it's not just about me and you, it's about the people who bring our society forward. And time again, when those people have been people of color, our society has tried to stop them using surveillance, and that's a problem.
And I guess, and I'd be curious as to your thoughts about this, I guess that once you acquire the data, whatever the information is, license plate numbers or Martin Luther King alleged sex tapes or whatever it might be, that personal information, you acquire an inordinate level of power over those people. So if you're disproportionately acquiring this kind of information about people who are A, potential future leaders, as you mentioned, B, members of, let's say, an oppressed minority or a struggling minority, then in effect, aren't you sort of aggravating an already existing power imbalance, A, and B, aren't you creating an almost irresistible temptation to use/abuse that power?
I think you are. If you look at seemingly innocuous data and you just get tons and tons of it, like call records, for example, you can figure out what doctors that person sees, whether they have, what kind of medical condition they have. You can figure out where their children go to school. You can figure out if they're having an extramarital affair. And so all of these things are things that regular human beings do or engage in, right? Both the positive and negative. And what surveillance does is it chills these people from engaging in activities that nowadays we look back and we say, Martin Luther King, of course, he needed to do what he did. But back then, to people in power, it wasn't so clear. And he was actually a threat. And so what all of this surveillance does is transfer an extraordinary amount of power into the hands of the powerful and chill the work, the valuable work of people who are pushing for and protecting and fighting for the weak.
You bring up a fascinating point, Alvaro Bedoya, because In my own work as a writer, for example, at one point I was writing about the politics of jihad and the concept of jihad in the Islamic world, and the fact that to many Muslims it means the greater jihad is internal struggle, not any kind of military struggle and all that. But I have to tell you that even I, as a privileged white person in this society, would hesitate. How many times am I going to type jihad in the Middle East, jihad in Syria, before something happens to me? If that has a chilling effect on my own inquiry and writing and exploration of a topic that's essential to our national security right now, what must it do to marginalize people?
That's right. And I think if you talk to people in America's Muslim community today, they would answer almost 2-1 that they feel watched, and that they do watch what they say and where they say it. And that when they go online, they watch what they search for. And these are innocent, law-abiding, tax-paying Americans. And in my mind, a world where you think twice about what you do and say because someone is watching, that's not a free society. And as a matter of fact, that's the society we live in today. And frankly, in addition to this constitutional idea of whether we live in a free society or not, one of the great promises of the internet is the capacity to explore, is the capacity to explore your sexuality online, without trying to figure out, are you gay? Are you straight?
Right.
Finding love online. A lot of people do that. I think, in fact, it's now the majority way in which a lot of people find their life partners, their spouses. And so if we are encouraging people to be more careful, I think we're erasing a really important part of life, which is exploring, and frankly, which is making mistakes. And so we're not only changing our political progress, but we're also hurting people's lives.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I also feel, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this, Alvaro Bedoya, which is, I feel that people, there's a loss of appreciation and desire to fight for privacy. I remember when the Snowden revelations came out, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle politically, particularly people supporting the current administration on this, as well as virtually all the Republicans I knew, with the exception of the Libertarians, were saying, well, it's not so bad because they're just taking the header information from your emails. And I don't get how that is qualitatively any different from somebody going into your mailbox every morning, writing down everybody you get a letter from and everybody you send a letter to. And if you ask people, are they comfortable with that? They'd say no, I would think, most people. So is there something about the technology that has made people, or some people, a little less committed to their own individual right to privacy?
You hit it on the head. I think to the extent that the outcry against the surveillance has been muted, and by the way, I do think there's a pretty substantial outcry against the surveillance that Edward Snowden revealed, is because it's hidden from our eyes. And another way to put what you described, if I knocked on everyone's door on my block and just said, good afternoon, ma'am. I'm a police officer. I would now like you to write down every single telephone number you've dialed in the last week and put it in this bag right here. And you know what? Don't worry, ma'am. We're not going to search this bag unless we have reasonable, articulable suspicion that someone is involved in terrorism or trying to harm the country. People would be outraged. This would be viewed as an extraordinary invasion of privacy. Yet that's precisely what the collection methods of NSA did for about a decade and a half or so to the American people. They just did it in a hidden way. And so I think that what we need to do is bring more of this activity out in the open. Obviously, we do need surveillance in this world because there are people who try to harm our country. But we need to be more transparent as possible about what's going on so people can have an opinion about it and can see what's going on. But you're exactly right that that technology does make people less aware of it, and that affects the public's response.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And by the way, thank you for pointing out that, of course, there is enormous support for changing some of the practices Edward Snowden revealed. And, of course, they have, some of them have, we're told, been changed. So I didn't mean to slight that. But I'm sometimes surprised by the lack of passion on this subject from some people. So I guess I would just close by this. You've made a great point here about the color of surveillance. You've made a great point about the need to be more vigilant. And really, this is not fair because we only have a minute left. But I'll just throw it out there that it also seems to me people are surprisingly indifferent about giving their personal information to private corporations, which can go to the government too, and often the conduit, and B, I remember having an argument with somebody about this a few years ago where they said Americans will never give up their civil liberties, and I said they'll give them up to play mafia wars if we don't watch out. So I guess where does private sector tracking of social media and all that fit into this?
So you hit a good point of everyone says they care about privacy, but they log on to Facebook and post what they ate for lunch, and then reveal their innermost feelings every single day. But I'll just say two things. The first is that there's a difference between sharing and taking. And so when I go and share something, I know I'm sharing it.
Right.
And yes, nowadays young people share more than the older generation has. But they are also acutely aware that when stuff is taken from them without their knowledge, that's a violation. And in general, I think that we tend to miss the fact that there's not enough basic ground rules of the road for privacy that would prevent us from making these choices. So a good analogy is the minimum wage. There's a lot of people out there who'd be willing to work for $5 an hour, which is below the federal minimum wage. But we as a society, even though they're willing to do that, have said, no, that's not okay. You need to get paid more than that. And that's what we're missing right now on commercial privacy. We're missing basic rules of the road that say what companies can and can't do, and to a certain extent take these decisions out of the hands of the companies, because these are the folks that have been structuring those decisions for the rest of us.
Right. No, I think that's tremendously well put. And this article, The Color of Surveillance, I encourage people to read it. And Alvaro Bedoya, Executive Director of the Center on Privacy and Technology and Adjunct Professor at Georgetown, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.